We are going to get started on our final panel, Intergenerational Communities and Alternative Housing. So before I introduce our moderator, it would be great if you could share your thoughts with us by answering our question, what are the barriers to aging in place? So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Robert McCartney. A retired Washington Post editor, columnist, and correspondent, McCartney now hosts the Think Regionally podcast, which focuses on the Washington metro area topics including housing, transportation, the environment, and racial and economic equity. In a 39-year career at the Post, McCartney was the top editor of the Metro section when the staff won the Pulitzer Prize for the breaking news reporting of the coverage of the 2007 Virginia Tech shootings. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to see everybody. I hope you've had lots of coffee before the final session so you don't nod off. We'll try to make sure you don't by keeping this lively and focused on reality and real things. I'd like to introduce our excellent panel, starting with Jennifer Molinsky, who is project director of the Housing and Aging Society program at the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. We have Rodney Harrel. You can all come up. Rodney Harrel, vice president for family, home, and community at AARP. Jennifer Ho, who's the commissioner for Minnesota Housing for the state of Minnesota. As we've already heard, Minnesota's been doing a lot of innovative, cutting-edge stuff on housing issues. And to wrap it up, Daniel Parolek, who's an architect and the author of the book Missing Middle Housing and the founding principal at Opticos Design. So we're talking about intergenerational communities and alternative housing. We had some discussions by Zoom beforehand to sort of talk about the various issues and topics that we wanted to bring up. And I'll just mention some of them at the beginning. Then each of the panelists will speak for 5 minutes, sort of talk a little bit about their perspective on the issues, and then we'll have what I hope is a lively discussion about both challenges but also solutions to the issues. So some of the things we've talked about: everybody ages, and most of us have family that is elderly, but we often think of aging as someone else's issue or a problem that is far away, so there's a denial factor in this debate. The statistics all show that the low-income aging population is most affected by access to affordable housing. There's a whole debate about whether aging in place is maybe something that people want, but it may not actually be what's best for them, so there's another denial issue there. It's very important to build and focus on non-traditional family types of housing. The single-family model does not necessarily serve the best interests of the population and community as a whole. There's a need for intentional building of multi-generational housing that can bring together housing for grandparents and other extended family members. This is a model that's increasingly important with the immigrant community, the expanding immigrant community. Then we want to talk about some of the barriers to these kinds of solutions, to building the missing middle housing, the kinds of non-traditional housing of which we need more. Some of the barriers are zoning, which we've already heard a lot about, the need for public education about what's best for the community, financing, shortage of financing, and the need for multiple sources, multiple avenues, streams of funding from both public and private sources. So those are some of the obstacles. And then I'd like to hear more about sort of what are the constituencies for pushing for progress? What kinds of people, what kinds of groups do we need to mobilize in order to get the kinds of advances that we want? But let's now hear from people who know much more about this than I do. And we'll start with Jennifer Molinsky. As I said, each person will talk a little bit about their perspective on this research that they've done. And Jennifer, we've asked to sort of lead with defining some of the challenge, the scale and scope of the challenge that we're facing.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And I'm very much looking forward to talking about solutions with my fellow panelists, but it is my task to sort of set out some of the challenges. So thanks to increased longevity and the aging of the large baby boom generation, we are today in the midst of unprecedented growth in our older population. We have more people alive today in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond than ever before. And in just the last decade, the number of people 65 and over in the US has risen from 39 to 58 million, and that's just over the last 10 years. Most of those people are in their 60s and 70s now, but within 3 short years, the leading edge of the baby boomers will turn 80. And we're gonna have a different need for housing with services and transportation and all the associated parts of that. We're in fact projecting that the number of households in their 80s will be doubling between now and 2038. This is actually a wonderful trend, and I want to pause there and say that we often talk about the challenges of housing an aging population, but the fact that we have such, that more people are growing older and thinking about how and where they want to live is a really wonderful thing. But of course it isn't without its challenges, and older adults are more likely to be unaffordably housed than younger people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Incomes fall in later life, and housing costs are not going down for most people. In fact, for renters, they're typically going up. And for homeowners, today, 27% of homeowners age 80 and over have mortgages on their properties. That's up 3% from 3 decades ago. So that's a really striking number. And almost 100% of those people who are earning low incomes are paying more than 30% of their income for their housing. In fact, fully a third of all older households, 11 million in total, are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. Half of those are paying more than 50%. And we know that this frequently leads people to cut back on food and medication. And we have millions of older adults who qualify for federal housing assistance but do not receive it because housing support is not an entitlement program. And not coincidentally, we have more and more unhoused people of advanced age. As people age, they're more likely to report difficulties with mobility, yet we estimate that less than 1% of housing stock in this country is accessible, less than 4% has some basic accessibility features. And the nation's housing stock is growing older too. It's got a median age of 43 years, and 9.5 million homes are structurally deficient in need of maintenance and investment. With age, more people are likely to require assistance with activities like housework, shopping, cooking, and care. And accessing services and supports at home is now a really fundamental part of the way that I think about aging in community or aging in place. You can have the house that needs to be accessible and affordable, but you need often the care and to be able to stay in that house. Because not everyone can rely on families, and because Medicare doesn't cover this kind of care, most people will need to purchase it. And at the going rate now, it's over $100 a visit on average in this country. So when we talk about solutions, I just want to say two more things. We must keep in mind the grave disparities in people's experiences of older age. Disadvantages compound with age, and people who have faced barriers across the life course and access to education, jobs, medical care, housing, they often have fewer financial resources at the end of life from which to draw. They're also more likely to experience disabilities earlier and challenges earlier. For millions of renters and even for millions of low-income homeowners, there's really little wealth available to draw upon in later life. The typical renter 65 and over has under $6,000 in total wealth. So try to factor in paying $100 an hour for $100 for a day for a visit from a home care provider, and you're out of it pretty much in a month or two. So just to conclude, we can and should ensure that our existing homes receive the investment that they need, that they are modified for accessibility, that there are sufficient supports for low-income older adults to remain safely and stably housed. But I think it's also important, and that's why we're here today, to invent some other alternatives to the current homes people occupy, including in the lower density communities where more and more older people are aging. The baby boom generation is a suburban generation, and we're seeing the biggest growth of older households in really low density places. And we need more options for the growing numbers of single people. 56% of people 80 and over, of households 80 and over, are single person households, as well as for the 1 in 5 older adults who live in a multi-generational household. So we're not talking about a homogeneous population, we're talking about a very diverse population. Given the crisis of loneliness, we also need more options for people of all ages that provide opportunities for connection and engagement. And I look forward to discussing these with all of you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So now we'll hear from Rodney Harrel from AARP, which has done a lot of work on housing. I know he is interested in talking about aging in place, but also the need for multi-generational housing and other kinds of options.
That's right, and thank you for the question, though, the setup. You know, as I listen to Jennifer, there's a couple of things that always stick with me. One is that number about the 1%, less than 1% of housing that has the features that people need while they age. Think about that. The vast majority, the 99% plus of homes don't have the features that we need at all ages. Another is the idea that by 2034, we're going to have more people over the age of 65 than under 18 for the first time in this country. And I think those two things are connected. The idea that we have had a country where we've focused on young families, young children, young people, that leads to mindsets that don't have homes or communities that meet the needs of people of all ages. But that's shifting, right? The entire country will soon have more people over 65 than under 18. And in many parts of the country, we're seeing that already. And frankly, in many of our houses, our homes, we're seeing people of multiple generations that aren't necessarily having their needs met. During COVID, many of us came face to face with the fact that as people by the tens of thousands died in nursing homes, I think about 180,000 if I recall, there's 180,000 families that saw that was the worst case scenario when there wasn't a housing option that worked for their loved one where they were. And we know that housing that's affordable and housing that's accessible are two of the biggest things that keep people from moving out of nursing homes. So that's a life or death thing that we have there. And so these are important issues. They're important for AARP, they're important for the country. And we've got our table behind me, and I've talked about our livable communities work and the rest this morning, because we see ourselves in a place where we need to talk about solutions. Zoning has come up many times today. And when I speak at the American Planning Association earlier this year, I saw that the zoning reform sessions were outside of the room. All the urban planners in the country were really trying to figure out how they could move that puzzle. And one of the things that's needed is a better understanding of the people in the communities. So one thing that AARP does is a lot of education. We want to teach people about the housing options that they might need, the things that might benefit them. I remember talking to a woman in Hoover, Alabama a few years ago. We talked in Hoover, she was from outside in rural Alabama, small town, and she was 80 plus, and she had this big 2-story house that she was living in, and she was firm that she was going to stay there forever. And I said, okay, well, what happens if you can't get up the stairs? What happens, what's their plan? And she didn't really have one. She said, oh, somebody, one of the girls down the street will help me out. But the idea that she hadn't really thought through is not just distinct to her or her place, but a lot of people haven't really thought about a plan. What happens if things change? A spouse dies, you can no longer do stairs, you can't drive anymore, things often change. And another quick story is in this region, we talked a lot about this region today. My own family, my own mother was contacted the other day by a family friend from years back. Government worker, worked hard and long for years, has some health issues. He's got cancer, he's got some other condition that's working on him, but he can't afford housing. And so he's trying to find a housing option that works for him. He's leaving the hospital and can't find a place. One thing my mother and I talked about was, well, it'd be great. Couldn't we build an accessory dwelling unit here? It would be a good idea. Maybe he could stay in it. They could rent it out later. But of course, I had to tell her in our county, that's not really allowed. So you can't do the accessory dwelling units here. So we don't have that option to be able to do that. So when people ask me why AARP is in housing, I always boil down to that one word that you heard from Jennifer and others and me, options. We just don't have enough options, right? And that's the barrier to us that we don't have the options to serve people of different ages, of different incomes, of different needs, and the ability to be where they are. So I want to leave you with that. And one other thing, though, the idea of past, present, and future. That we talked to some of these panels today about some of the issues of zoning and what the challenges we have now. Well, those things didn't happen by accident. Many of these things were put into communities to keep people out of communities, to preserve a sense of community as what it was. People in the present are not necessarily served by those communities. They don't have enough options. Our livability index shows that 80% of neighborhoods only have single-family housing, for example. So what about people who want to downsize or move? They can't do that. And the future, as we're aging, means we need to change these things. So as a society, we need to think about that. As an individual, we need to think about that. So we all need to think about options in our past, present, and future if we're going to really impact housing.
Thank you, Rodney. So next we'll hear from the government, in this case the state government, Jennifer Ho, the Commissioner for Minnesota Housing.
Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. There's two things I want to leave with you today. Is that if you imagine having a bucket list, things you want to do before you die, I suggest the last thing you put on your bucket list is, I want to die well. And it'll be great the day you check that off. Right? You'll have done everything on your list. The first thing you should put on your bucket list, I want to have a plan so that I am capable of dying well. Because everything else that you put on your bucket list, Mardi Gras, Kentucky Derby, whatever it is you put on your bucket list, you'll either go or you won't go depending on your health and your financial situation. But I can promise you one thing, you will die. I think, first of all, I've had a chance to sit with two of these on many of occasions. And when I first read The Housing Needs of Older Adults from the Harvard Joint Center, I was just so depressed. Because I realized, we have saved less than we should have. We're going to live longer than we thought we were. Therefore, we are going to die poor and we are going to die alone. But that is actually the truth. It is actually the truth. And so absorbing that fact and planning everything you can so that you are hedging against that fact is really, really important. And, baby boomers in quintessential style, and I can say this because I'm 1 year younger than a boomer, they're going to make aging the me generation of aging like they did everything else. But it's possible that it will kind of shift. It will shift, how we think about this, because once they come to terms with the fact that they are in fact going to die, and possibly poorer because they didn't plan far enough ahead, and why did they refinance their mortgage at 55 for a 30-year? I don't know. We've got to just kind of take this stuff as fact. I am living this as fact every day as Jennifer, the daughter of Ben and Mary. Ben and Mary live in a house that they bought 2 weeks before I was born. They still live in that house. Everything they've purchased since 1965 is still in that house. That house was great for raising a family of 5. We oftentimes had one more kid in the house for various reasons. And it's a ranch, it's a suburban ranch right outside of Minneapolis. In the grand scheme of things, if the washer and dryer weren't in the basement, it would be a great place for them to live. If it wasn't 3-step entry that freezes over in both the backyard and the front yard every winter, it'd be a great place to live. If they didn't require a car to do just about everything in their life, it would be a great place for them to live. Both of my parents are still driving. Delightful. I won't ride with them anywhere. But they don't live in a community that was designed for them to grow old and die at home, and they have promised me they will die at home, and when I walk through the house, I am confident they are right. And I say this as a housing finance commissioner because I have builders come and talk to me all the time, and they want to build for low-income families, and they tell me they want to build split levels. And I go visit my more affluent friends, and they seem to have houses that have 7 levels. I don't know why there's 3 steps between every single floor. And it's how can we be in such enormous denial about the difference between our current state when we purchase and our end state right before we die. And yet we all insist we want to die at home. So one of the things that I think about a lot in my role as the government, thanks Bob, is that people who are more affluent, are going to make the choices that they make, and they probably are going to be able to afford the paid help. But the reality of the fact that there aren't young folks and there's a shrinking workforce actually means the rest of us have to make a plan without paid help, because either we don't have the money or we're on Medicaid because we're now poor, but there's nobody there to actually do the job of coming to take care of you in your home, or maybe even if you end up in another care facility. So the plan is really important, because you think that you're going to die with a bunch of people around you being paid to take care of you, but they actually aren't going to exist. And their choice is going to be to clean up after you or to have another job, because there's going to be a really competitive environment. So having that plan is important, and facing the facts of the fact that we are all going to die. And unless we're really, really, really in the affluent part of society, we're probably all going to die poor and alone. And there's not going to be anybody who's willing to be paid to take care of us. So what we try to do is really think about, when we're doing housing finance, that every unit of housing that we think about is probably going to have somebody with a mobility impairment at some point in time living in it. Maybe not the first day it's built, maybe not the first day it's sold, but at some point in time, somebody's going to live in the house with a mobility impairment. Am I forcing everybody who builds for us to make everything universally accessible? No. I mean, do I wish I could? Yes. Am I signaling in that direction? I'd like to. But I'm still working against the denial of the fact that what people want and what we really should have as a society are still deeply at odds. One of the early panelists just talked about kind of the behavioral change work that we need to do in our own minds around this. And I just think really understanding how we want to live. And we have the advantage of learning from our parents and our grandparents and everybody else around us as we deal with these hard choices. But I think the key is that we kind of generationally use this as an opportunity to radically change the way we think about this, so that we can actually plan for it and do a better job.
Well, I have to say, I'm not sure I've ever heard a more entertaining discussion of a really depressing situation as you just provided. So thank you.
I'm from the government, Bob. I'm here to help.
She's from the government, and she's here to help. So now, turning to the man who literally wrote the book on missing middle housing, Daniel Parolek, who's going to talk about the various kinds of alternative options that we need to provide for the older people, but also other people who need housing that's more affordable.
Yes, thanks, Bob. I will say this is the first time I've ever followed a speaker on a panel that was talking about dying. So, but it's right. That's the reality.
It's
but
okay, Bob, it's gonna. Dan,
it's a reality. So we're all gonna die, but the other reality is almost every community in the country needs to figure out ways to deliver housing choices, and missing middle housing is one tool that we recommend every city of every size, whether they're urban or rural, think about. And so I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to talk about how missing middle housing is defined by us, and how we're using it with private sector clients and public sector clients to provide solutions in cities across the country to deliver housing that addresses attainability or affordability, our aging population, as well as livability, as Rodney talked about earlier in his presentation earlier today. So part of the reality, and it's come up over and over and over, but I just want to emphasize this, is even the most basic missing middle housing solution, like this cottage court, this harmless cottage court, is illegal to build in about 90+% of cities across the country, right? It shouldn't be that way. The other problem, and I think one of the reasons that the missing middle concept has caught on so broadly, is we've done a horrible job of communicating with our communities about the need for housing choice. So if you go into a community and say, we're going to increase the density in your neighborhood, how many communities do you think are going to be like, yay, we're going to increase the density in our neighborhood, probably none. Or we're going to upzone your neighborhood. Or we're going to add multifamily to your single-family neighborhood. These are absolutely the wrong ways to frame the conversation about housing in your communities. And so the missing middle housing concept that I first wrote about a little over 10 years ago for a Smart Growth Network publication has proven to be a very effective way to start and engage a community in a conversation about these much-needed housing choices. And for us, form and scale is key, and so we define this as house-scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. And it's the duplex, the fourplex, the cottage court, the courtyard apartment that exist in every neighborhood built prior to the 1940s, but we basically zoned and policied out of existence over the last 6, 7, 8 decades. And it's a really important part of the conversation. How this fits into this affordable housing barbell is that, right, we have the need for capital A affordable or subsidized housing, and we also have the need to increase the volume and the amount of housing we produce generally, and right in the middle is where the missing middle can be one of the housing tools in a jurisdiction's toolkit, where if it's done thoughtfully, it can deliver what we call affordable by design or attainable. And so it's shown to be effective. So zoning is an out-of-date operating system. That camera on your left was built the same year that zoning was put in place. So can you think of any other operating system that we're using today that was created in the early 1900s that hasn't been either completely thrown out and overhauled or just completely rethought? And I think we talk about issues with zoning, but we rarely dive down really deeply into, well, why is it a problem? Why is it not working? And so it's never efficiently delivered housing choice. If you think about most of the really great housing choices that exist in places like DC or Chicago or Memphis or Cincinnati, they were built prior to zoning being put in place. So just something to think about. So what we've found in our work with cities and developers across the country, as well as assessing others' work, it's really easy to crank up the development potential on lots to deliver projects that are feasible for developers, right? We're gonna allow more units on a lot. But what's really hard is the more nuanced approach, which we feel is really necessary to dial up the allowed development potential, but also make sure that on this missing middle sweet spot diagram that you're also making sure that those policies, that zoning change is also gonna deliver attainable housing choices. And it often misses that mark, where it delivers housing, but it's not actually housing that's attainable. And so the other thing is, it kind of baffles me that we feel that the same old planning and zoning tools and strategies that have been ineffective in delivering these choices are what a lot of cities are still trying to use to provide the solutions. And so I think it's going to take a lot of thinking outside the box and some new planning tools and zoning tools. And for example, we've created this process that we call a missing middle scan. And we've used this in cities and counties across the country, where over a 3-month process, we come in and work with the staff and identify, first of all, where that city or county should prioritize the application of missing middle, related to a lot of different aspects, including mobility choices and walkability. And then we also do a deep dive into the zoning, and we assess the zoning 3-dimensionally on existing lot sizes to identify exactly what's wrong: minimum lot size setbacks, allowed densities, parking, floor area ratios, open space requirements. And we say, these are the 10 things you need to change to deliver missing middle in your communities. And then a really, really important part of this is assessing the potential displacement, especially of communities that are at risk, and this is often the Black and brown communities that we've talked about a lot today. And we're doing a citywide missing middle strategy for the city of Sacramento right now. And we're working with a really great team led by Cascadia, who's doing this really amazing displacement risk analysis to make sure that when the city does enable missing middle broadly across the city, that it's not pushing investment into these neighborhoods where the property values are lower to really put the fuel on the fire of displacement. So it's a really important aspect that every city needs to be thinking about. And because this problem has spread so broadly, we feel, and we've really been focusing on providing regional solutions. And most recently, we worked with the Washington State Department of Commerce, and we did a palette of missing middle educational tools, videos, posters, and then ended up writing a zoning toolkit that can be used by 70+ jurisdictions in the region to remove those zoning barriers for missing middle. So we feel like this is a great sort of a shared strategy that can be utilized in a lot of different regions across the country. What we found is that if the cities allow it, the developers will show up and deliver it. And this is an example of a project that we designed for a developer in the Salt Lake City region, where with thoughtful design and missing middle typologies, they were able to deliver these units at a price point of about 30 grand less per unit, which was a really good reason for them because they were shooting for delivering homes that could be purchased by entry-level buyers in that market. But you really need to be thoughtful about what you're enabling, because if you allow this type that we tuck under townhouse or the slot home, this is what your building community will deliver. And what are the issues with this? Number one, these buildings do not deliver attainability. Number two, in terms of the aging population, 3 stories of stairs, it's the absolute wrong type for this rapidly aging population, and they really don't make good neighbors in a lot of locations. And so we can talk about that, but we also need to be thinking about, right, the demographic shifts of households. And we've worked in a lot of communities where we're doing a public participation process and they're like, we culturally want to live multi-generationally, but we have to buy a big single family home and make it work. And so we often are designing these multi-generational houses and also writing zoning codes to reinforce sort of in the allowance of that 3-unit building on a very small lot. We also realized that infill is great, but because of such a huge need for these missing middle housing types, that it needs to be delivered at scale. So we're also delivering missing middle housing neighborhoods at larger scales. And a closing thought. So Chris Nelson did the demographic and the market demand research in my book, and he found that 62% of all homes built between now and 2040 would need to be missing middle housing to meet demand. So it's really going to take solutions by every single one of us in the room to meet that growing demand and that need. And I just want to put a shout out for the bookstore here. They were kind enough to sell my book, and also look at the great resources that we've created in collaboration with AARP over the last couple of years, including this publication, that it's a great way to introduce missing middle housing to your communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Let me ask one quick follow-up. 62% of the housing built between now and 2040 needs to be missing middle housing. If current trends continue, about what percentage would it be? In other words, what's the delta?
Yeah, so that number was also done about 3 years ago, so it's probably already about 10% higher. And I think it's only going to continue to grow based on rising land costs, construction costs, labor costs. So it's only going to continue to grow. And so it just sort of reinforces are we going to be able to deliver 60% of all housing as missing middle? Probably.
Well, what percentage of missing middle housing is being built now?
Oh, it's low. It's less than 10%.
So it's less than 10% now, and we need to get to 70%.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's the scale of the issue, right there. Okay, so let's talk first a little bit about where we're trying to get to, and then we'll talk about the solutions and challenges and barriers to the solution. So one thing that we've talked about is and Jennifer Ho talked about this very articulately, is the issue of people want to die at home. They want to stay in their homes until they die. Rodney, is that what's really best for people? I mean, is that what's desirable for people?
Well, let's start here, that the vast majority of people do want to stay in their homes and communities as long as they can. It's about 8 out of 10 of those 50 and older, and about 9 out of 10, 65 and older, say that whenever we ask them that question. But to your point, why? Now, they built lives in those homes and those communities, right? They've raised their children, their memories are there. Some of our speakers earlier talked about just the connection we have to home, to community, religious institutions, all the things that we might have and love there. But to the question you just asked, Dan, if we don't have enough options in my community for me to do something else, to stay with the connection, all those things, I don't have a missing middle unit next, or an accessory dwelling unit next door, or something I could downsize in, then my only choice is to go somewhere far away or go to a facility to do something where I have to give all of those things up. I can't go see my friends. I can't go to my favorite park bench. I can't do all of those things I wanted to do. And so to me, it boils down to people want to stay for a range of reasons, but to the point that we've talked about, all of us have talked about, there just aren't enough options to be able to do that well. And we're choosing from this restricted set of options. Frankly, it's one option. It's the house I have, because I either can't afford or can't find something else I want in the place where I want to be. And so hopefully by opening up more options, and maybe even if I had a home that was universally designed, that had the features I needed in the first place, it wouldn't be so compromising for me to stay there either. So again, we're limited on both ends by not having enough options.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer from Harvard, as opposed to Jennifer from Minnesota, what kind of options should we be looking for? I mean, what are the various things that we should be trying to build?
Well, I think about all that range of household types. So single people, couples, multi-generational households. We need just options on all that will work for all those folks. So accessory dwelling units in our downtowns, in our little village centers of our suburbs. We really need more multifamily. If we can create more walkable communities within the suburbs and lower density places that we have, I think that works not just for older adults, but for millennials who say that they want to be car-free and they want to be in a walkable community, and we still see them going to the suburbs. They want a different kind of suburban experience, though. So this is, I think, something that we can build for the future. I think it is the multi-generational house. I'm not an architect, so I'm going to defer to Dan, but flexible housing, right? So that you can rent out that unit in the backyard, or that's part of your house, but it can become the home of a caregiver, or it can become the place your adult child comes back to, or what have you over the years. So I think there's all sorts of possibilities, and some of them are retrofitting what we've got, and some of them I think are the strategic infilling of the kind of housing that Dan's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer from Minnesota. You mentioned when you were talking before that you get developers who come in and they're talking about putting steps everywhere. How do you get developers to think differently and sort of accept what's needed for the aging population?
Well, and I think if your most important goal is to drive the cost of a single-family home as low as possible, then the split level is actually a logical conclusion. But I think the issue is that we can't just have one goal. And I think that, I have the opportunity to reflect that because I'm doling out a scarce resource, and I can put priorities and points around what I fund and what I don't fund. I think the car and the house are, one or the other will get us, right? And so I think we have to think about where, and I think we have to think about livability as we age. I'm willing to take, one or the other out. I think that if I could have a fourplex on the block that my parents have lived on for 58 years, and it was in that same neighborhood with those same neighbors, my mom could walk the exact same path that she has walked every day of her life, right? Know that she knows every dog, if she could move into a single level fourplex, it wouldn't even have to be assisted because that neighborhood is close knit. They took care of people who died at home before them, and the people in that neighborhood will take care of them when they die at home. So it could at least get them out of the house that might hurt them. I don't know that I'm going to get out of the neighborhood that they have to give up the car, but eventually I can get a doctor to write a note that says they're not allowed to drive anymore. I do not look forward to the day. But at least I got a solution on that when it becomes, really dangerous. Right now it's just dangerous. So, but I couldn't go in and even build that fourplex today in that community because it's not allowed. Yeah. But it would have been a perfect solution if, when my parents were capable of kind of advocating before the neighborhood was 100% filled out with single-family homes. I mean, it could have been a community conversation about if we really all want to stay in this community, what can we do to create the supports, to do that. And so I just think it needs to be just a different conversation around what we want to build and why. And I think we have to take out any single factor as being the most important factor, like driving down cost. But you can't you can't require every community to be walkable, or I couldn't do things in vast majorities of the state of Minnesota, right? I mean, I get complaints from developers in greater Minnesota all the time about those walkability points. And, so I just think it just needs to be a different conversation, but it needs to be a conversation that centers the fact that we all want to grow old. It beats the alternative. We all would prefer to age in the communities of our choice. And the communities that we have don't work well for that. And so how do we just get people to think about it differently? How do we get people to want something different than what they want today?
Right, I think public education is an important part of this. I should have mentioned at the beginning that I think I'm the only boomer up here.
Sorry.
And sure enough, we're obsessed at my house with decluttering, the Swedish death cleaning, so that my poor son doesn't have to go through all of our stuff. And we're looking to move to some place that's on one level because my wife has mobility issues. And so we're right where you were describing. So I'm going to ask Dan a question that is really in some ways at the heart of this. I mean, we all agree that we need more of the missing middle housing, more duplexes, more fourplexes, more cottage courts and courtyard buildings. There seems to be widespread agreement that that's what's needed. So why isn't the market delivering that? I mean, that's what the market's supposed to do, right? Is respond to need, to popular need. What's the dysfunction in the market there?
Well, I think first of all is that local jurisdictions in most instances haven't made fast enough changes to remove the barriers to let the market respond. And that's why in a lot of states now the state's passing housing legislation at the state level to remove some of those barriers, like Oregon, California, Nebraska, I think North Carolina just did it. So, like I said, where the jurisdictions have removed the barriers, we have seen the response from the market and developers. But I will say that what I also see, though, is there's such a shortage of housing, just housing overall, that you could build anything and it would likely sell or rent. So there's less of an incentive for that private sector to actually make changes to their business model to deliver something different than what their business plan has been based on. So there is, I would say that the change in the private sector is happening slower than I think any of us would like to see, but it's also just, we need to remove the barriers first to make that happen.
Yeah, I want to come back to the barriers in a minute, but before that, I want to ask Rodney the extent to which the increase in the immigrant community is changing the parameters here, because there's been a lot of discussion about many of the immigrant families are multi-generational and they have multi-generational households, and how is that affecting the discussion?
Yeah, I think I want to answer that, but I also want to tie something together. I think that what we're saying here is that the idea that we just don't have enough supply it's back to your point about public education. I want to just hammer in on that for a second because that's so important to what AARP is trying to do, to try to explain to people about the benefits of these things. That's why we have all the products that I was talking about. We're trying to help legislators. That's why we have a model act on missing middle and on ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and other things, because we want to get the information out there so that people understand how things benefit them through those things, through videos, through articles, all of the rest of this, so that they'll demand it more, so that builders will have more of a reason to build it, so we'll get more of it, and frankly, maybe we'll push more legislation of the types that create more options for people. So all of that is all interconnected. And to your question about the multi-generational housing, particularly with Asian and Latino immigrants, you see a lot of multi-generational housing. There's not a cultural stigma around it. One of the things that we haven't talked about much is the ideal of the American dream, and the I feel like everyone at some way, shape, or form sees themselves as a cowboy in the open range to some extent, that you've got this big land that's yours, even if it is your eighth of an acre in your suburban cul-de-sac. But the idea that those folks that are coming in to this country are bringing that with them are bringing those same housing styles, and they may be in communities and they're growing, and of course we're becoming more diverse as a country, so we're getting more multi-generational housing that way. But also, I think that's impacting communities in the sense that it's not foreign to see shared housing. It's not foreign to see multiple generations in a home in your neighborhood, even if you're not part of one of those groups. So we're seeing those numbers go up and up year by year, and especially as housing becomes more expensive, I think we're going to continue to see more multi-generational housing amongst all types of folks.
Can I just hop on that for a second, though? Because I think back to my German and Swedish ancestors. They lived multi-generationally. They just did it on farms in the country. And I think what we're seeing with newer immigrant families is that they also are living multi-generationally, but they're doing it in our cities. And so it's the urban life that wasn't built for this. It's not that this is something that's unique to this generation of immigrants. And I think that it is kind of this Americanization of what a family unit is, and this programming around everybody should have their own home, and we need more square foot per child than we ever needed. I swear to God, I got a neighbor, bought the house 3 years ago, got married 2 years ago, had a kid a year ago, and just moved out because the house was too small. And I thought, a family of 3 lived there for 60 years, and it worked then. But it's just this programming that we've done around square foot per person, and you can only have 2 generations and call it a home. And that's just an American programming. It's not immigrant programming, and it's not indigenous programming either. We see a lot of multi-generational living in indigenous communities as well. It's this uniquely American brand of mine.
Very true.
Bravo, bravo. I should mention 2 of my grandparents were born on farms in Minnesota. So they were, they were in multi-generational housing units. Right. So let's talk about the 2 big elephants in the room, which are zoning and NIMBYism, very closely related. 2 of the big barriers, 2 of the biggest barriers, perhaps, to the solutions that we've been discussing. And I want to start with Jennifer from Harvard. What do you think? How do these play out, and what do we do about them? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
How do we solve NIMBYism? I live in a community in the inner suburb of Boston that has been trying to do zoning reform for 12 years. And
excuse me, what kind of zoning reform are they trying to do?
They're trying to, we're a community that is blessed with transit and multiple villages and little centers throughout the town. We are blessed with walkability. And we'd like to create more housing around our transit system. And the state of Massachusetts actually came out with a zoning imperative for the 101 jurisdictions, 103 jurisdictions that are within the Boston metro area that are served by transit, that we need to start putting more housing near transit. We can't just have single family homes around transit. and I live in a progressive town, but when it comes to changing what, people, change is hard, I guess. And I've heard people say, oh no skyscrapers here. We're talking about 5-story buildings, but the hyperbole is really over the top. And more maybe reasonable people say, well, reasonable in the sense that they're not as hyperbolic. They say, I didn't come here to live next door to an apartment. That's not why I moved here. And so it's again that shifting of conversation, that we're part of a region, we're part of a region that is really suffering for a lack of affordable housing. Our community is suffering for the lack of diversity of people that can come to live there. It is not, we're cutting off opportunities for our older people to age in place. The situation around Boston, and I'm sure it's true here too, is that someone who owns a single-family ranch house that they've owned for 60 years cannot sell it and move into the condo, in the condo that's smaller, but it's closer to transit or it's closer to the bus or something. It just doesn't work. So downsizing is not saving anybody any money. So I'm not sure how we solve it. I had hope before I wrote that report that depressed Jennifer so much, that something that Jennifer said years ago was, we were at a panel together and you said aging is a universal aspiration, and I hope that kind of mentality would, we would realize that we're doing this to ourselves, but I think there's still such a fear of density and change and traffic, and that we're still stuck in this mire.
Mm-hmm. Dan, you wrote in your book specifically about this. What are the kinds of strategies for getting people to think differently about zoning and density? I mean, I believe you actually don't want them to talk about density at all, yes. Right? Don't refer to density.
When we're working with cities, we say we're going to do a long-term game, and anytime you use the D word, you have to put a quarter into the jar. It's like the cuss jar, It's hard, but I think it's more about personalizing the conversation, right? To have your community members tell personal stories about how missing middle was part of their life, is part of their life with their kids, their best friend, their grandmother. And I think personalizing in that way is a really great start. The second thing is visualizing, and that's like been a real focus of our work, is what does it mean to have a fourplex on a 50-foot wide lot on a street that has mostly single-family homes? And so we've visualized that. And historically, we show examples of, like, historically, here's a block that had a mix of single-family homes and fourplexes and fiveplexes, and you wouldn't even notice it if you walked down the street. And then, I do want to make the point is that I think you have to be respectful and listen to the concerns, but we can't let a vocal minority drive our policy decisions and to sort of put our cities in handcuffs and not enable them to really respond in a way to deliver the choices that every community needs.
I was looking at Dan's book last night, and he said specifically, you should, in public discussions, avoid referring to density, multifamily, or upzoning, and instead talk about specific housing types like duplex, townhouse, courtyard apartment, and cottage court. So that's part of the educational process. So now, government. Minnesota is, as I mentioned before, is at the forefront of progress. So tell us about how that's looking, and how did you do it, and what should everybody else be doing that Minnesota's already doing?
I don't think it's true. I just don't think it's true. I think that Minneapolis tried to get rid of exclusive single family. I think that there's a battle in the courts now around that. There wasn't a ton of stuff that was just immediately built. I read that article about how our low inflation rate was tied to the changing of single-family zoning in Minneapolis, and I thought, who was the reporter who wrote this? They haven't driven down a single street in Minneapolis to realize it doesn't substantially look different since that policy was made. And so, sorry if the reporter who wrote that's in the room. I'm sure it was very fantastic reporting. It just didn't reflect my experience in my community.
It's always the media's fault.
We also have, we have the worst home ownership gap between blacks and whites in like the fourth worst in the whole country. I don't think we're getting much right. I was really struck in some of the earlier panels today about the centering of the experience of black communities, of indigenous communities, of immigrant communities, and figuring out how to do some of this stuff there right first. Because the undertone to zoning and the undertoning to density and the undertoning to all that is racism and elitism. Wealthy folks don't want to live around poor folks, and white folks don't want to live around black and brown folks. So let's go do this right in black and brown communities. I think that is would be like an amazing thing to nurture and demonstrate. Like look where it is that people who are going to grow old and not have a lot of means are figuring out how to build communities that support people being able to do those things the way they want to do them. But a lot of these policy discussion tables, a lot of these elected tables, a lot of these government tables aren't populated that way and aren't oriented that way. And so, I think that it is a real opportunity, because I think it's one place where we can cut through. What's horrible about talking about race in Minnesota? Want some pie? That's the joke. But if we actually did this in black communities in Minnesota, we wouldn't have to talk about why racism is stopping us from doing the right thing. And so I'm really inspired by some of the conversations I heard earlier around the energy and resiliency, and thinking about that, how that cross-pollinates with these other things that we've been talking about. It inspires me for thinking about how I want to go home and engage in the aging conversation, in aging neighborhoods that are predominantly black. That sounds very exciting to me. So thank you.
I was a journalist for more than 40 years, and I think that's the first time I ever told a public official that I thought they were doing a great job, and they argued with me. I really applaud the emphasis on just saying outright that the issues are about racism and elitism. Both of those, racism and elitism. I see a lot of that in my own community. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, in Bethesda, Maryland. I've been covering local news for the second half of my career, and I do a podcast now for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments that talks a lot about these issues. And this is what you see. This is what you see. You see very progressive communities. Montgomery County, couldn't be more liberal, and upper class liberal, professional liberal, but still liberal. But you start talking about putting an apartment house in the neighborhood, and everybody just goes aghast, just like that, and sort of trying to publicly educate people that's the wrong approach right now. That's not what we need, and that the progressive approach is to build the multifamily housing, the missing middle housing. Trying to get that message through, I think, is really critical to what's going on here. So we're still trying to talk about solutions. Let's got to talk a little bit about financing. All of this is going to cost money. Anything about housing, you all know better than I do. You want to build any kind of housing that's affordable, you got to have multiple levels of financing. You've got to have public financing, you've got to have tax credits, you've got to have help from philanthropy, you've got to layer in all the levels of financing in order to get anything done that anybody's going to be able to afford. So what are some solutions there? How can we get more streams of financing for housing affordability? Jennifer?
Well, I'll start with one that isn't a new stream, but I would suggest that we could be more flexible in some of the funding that we have. So this panel is about intergenerational, and there's a growing interest, I think, in creating communities that are intentionally intergenerational. And I'm not just talking about apartment buildings, I'm talking about communities where, like co-housing kind of a community. We just did a study of this model that the government supports in Germany. Lots of intergenerational relationships, lots of mutual support, big focus on accessibility. And when we think about doing that here, a lot of our funding streams are, like Section 202 is for elderly housing, and you can't really do multi-generational. You have to have special funding and exception to do grandparents housing within Section 202. A whole host of other restraints and restrictions on selecting tenants for these properties. There's a great example, there's a few examples around the country, Hope Meadows, Bridge Meadows in Portland, and in Massachusetts, Treehouse. And these are communities that have come together to support families adopting children out of the foster care system, and older adults who are not related live on campus, in cottages or in apartment buildings, and they're all participating in each other's lives and offering support to each other and growing as a community. Really hard to fund for some of these reasons because they're trying to do something innovative, and the funding structures are what they are. They're designed to, so rethinking the existing funding would be something that I would call for. Just what can we do with what we've got?
Okay. Dan, and then Jennifer, funding. What are your thoughts about increasing the streams of revenue available for this?
I mean, definitely not my area of expertise, but what I'll say is we've been working with a couple of capital A affordable housing developers in Northern California to try to figure out if and how these missing middle typologies can be delivered within their systems. And what we're finding is that in places like most of Northern California, the values are too high for it to make any sense to do these smaller typologies, and so the projects tend to push toward the podium 5/2, 5/1, 4/1 building types. And so we're trying to figure out if and how missing middle can play a role in that subsidized housing in that development model. But to date, we've just been trying to innovate and let the private market drive affordability by design, which tops out at different points in different markets, but it usually sort of starts at about 80% median income and above, and anything below needs the subsidy to be delivered.
So where does the money come from for the subsidy?
It's low-income housing tax credits, the new market credits. Like, it's a really, I'm not an expert in it. I'm sorry. But it's complex, and I think that's part of why it's been hard for those affordable housing developers that we've collaborated with to try to figure out how the missing middle fits into their delivery system and their financing structure. It's been really hard.
Jennifer Ho, what are your thoughts on money?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of housing in America is privately built and privately bought and not regulated and not subsidized except through the tax code, which absolutely reinforces that a single-family home gives you preferred tax status. At least it did before the standard deduction went up, and I haven't sat with researchers since then to understand the impact of that. So I mean, everything, including the tax code, said being in a single-family home and being a single-family homeowner was going to be the way that the federal government took care of the vast majority of Americans in terms of a subsidy. We just don't call it a subsidy because these are rich people. We call it a subsidy when they're poor people. I mean, and to that, I would just say too, I mean, who here wants to live in, we're in DC, so some of you live in unaffordable housing, but who wants to live in unaffordable housing? I mean, it's not like we want poor people to live in affordable housing and the rest of us would prefer to live in unaffordable housing. It's just that we make different amounts of money, right? So like housing that we can afford is what everybody wants. It's just that we don't all make the same amount of money, right? And so I think there's ways in which we think about how we talk about this stuff. I mean, we were, like a Joe Manchin away from housing and Build Back Better, But I'm not certain that we had actually thought about, if we had the largest federal investment in housing in a generation, if that was the package that we actually wanted. I mean, we cheered it on when it was there and we grieved it when it was gone, but I don't think we've had time to think about, like, what would we really ask for if we really thought that we were going to get it, to make this happen. But I think it would involve rethinking the tax code and the way that the tax code reinforces what we do. I think it would be rethinking an investor-driven way of building housing for poor people. I think it would be a lot of just, I mean, I think we would rethink the voucher program in terms of how things like that are used. So, I mean, I think it deserves a top to bottom rethink, and since it doesn't seem like Congress is going to do anything soon, we got a little bit of time to do that. But I also think that the problem of housing in America is so acute that at some point in time, we will get over our racist, elitist instincts and actually try to do the right thing, because housing is hurting everybody, right? Housing is hurting everybody. I mean, I always love seniors as the gateway drug to housing affordability, because we all aspire to be there. But now it's like, it's people whose adult children are boomeranging back into the house. It's like, it is starting to affect people of all income levels in terms of thinking about housing. It's the big employers, it's the little employers, it's the rural employers. I mean, it is a coast-to-coast issue. It might just be a burn and fire on the two coasts, but it is a coast-to-coast issue. It is not just an urban issue, it is an urban, suburban, and rural issue. There is no part of the country, at least no part of the country, that is experiencing economic growth that is not grappling with this, and places that aren't experiencing economic growth are experiencing the problems of economic decline and aging populations, and so they're going to have to deal with it in a different kind of way. But I don't know that we know what to ask for. But the tools that we have got us in this position in the first place. So I don't think a tweaking or extension of those tools as the generational change is necessarily the best way to approach the idea of what would you ask for. I think Congress is eventually going to have to act. I think people who care deeply about doing this in equitable ways, really need to think about what we should be asking for. And I think that the moneyed interests will pull towards their interests just fine. So those of us who are willing to think about the less moneyed interests, and those of us who are willing to confront the realities of death, have the opportunity to maybe think about this in fresher ways.
Yeah. Right. Well, I don't think we're at a tipping point yet, but I would say one sign that says we could be approaching a tipping point on this issue where it would reach critical mass and people would actually start doing something serious about it is that the more, I talk a lot to business people in the Washington area, especially in the suburbs, and you talk to business people, senior business people, they're very concerned about the housing problem. I mean, we saw Amazon just put $2 billion into it, the last panel. I think that was partly because they got so much grief over the gentrification challenges over their HQ2 process. But just the fact that they're putting up that kind of money and that so many business people are concerned that they can't attract talent because the young, smart people can't afford to move there, that's something that augurs in favor of having that tipping point that I think Jennifer is talking about. So we only have a few more minutes. So let's talk about practical ways to develop popular support for the kinds of changes that we've been talking about. In other words, what are the constituencies? What are the popular political constituencies that need to be mobilized to generate popular pressure and popular support to push for these issues? And I think AARP is the best place to start because they're very involved in trying to develop that constituency.
Sure, absolutely, and that's one of the things that what ties some threads together from the last conversations. That building that constituency involves helping people to understand what the issues are that they're facing that they don't understand. that we did a study years ago where we were trying to figure out how we're going to measure livability across the country. And what soon became clear was that when we talked to people, we couldn't talk to them about their future selves. We couldn't talk to them about what happens if you don't drive? What happens if something happened to your spouse or you couldn't walk upstairs and the like? What we had to do was talk to people who were already in those circumstances to understand the kinds of changes that communities needed, and then really try to show and demonstrate to others that was the case that might impact them later. And I think many of us, and I want to pull on some of the threads that Jen was talking about, are the thinking about ourselves, but not necessarily seeing the issues that impact others as impacting us. And so there's a lot of othering in housing and a lot of othering in life in general. And so the idea that we might restrict our zoning, we might restrict the kinds of housing options we have to keep those people out. But then what happens to you when you need that, or your friend needs that, or your relative needs that? So demonstrating the beauty of options, sharing stories of people like you who might have needed those things, and also honestly setting policies and practices in that really demonstrate what things could be, help people visualize what could be for them. So when the town next over has housing and it's not scary, they have different housing options. I've seen that snowball effect happen to the next community over. Starts to think about, well, maybe we should have accessory dwelling units, or maybe we should have some missing middle housing, or maybe we should have something else here too. And the same thing happens to us as individuals. So to me, really, it's about building that constituency. The constituency is really all of us. And the idea is that we need to do more to call out those things that may be underlying. Maybe it's issues of trying to keep certain people of different racial groups or whatever out of your communities that are underlying why you're pro parking requirements, or you're pro other limitations, other poison pills that can stop housing options from happening. If that's the case, then let's show you a zoning code that works, and let's actually have a discussion about the other piece that we don't want to talk about as much. So again, it's just a whole variety of things we can do to really help people see what their future might be, what might impact them, but also to think about how what they're doing impacts others as well.
Jennifer Molinsky, why don't you bring us home with your thoughts on developing popular support for these programs?
I think one constituent group that we should pay attention to are caregivers, and because they understand a lot of these challenges and perhaps are positioned to advocate at the local level, right? So I think when you see firsthand the impacts of an inaccessible house or the lack of transportation options, that's a group I think that's important to include. And I guess I would just end my own thoughts here with, I think there's a lot of depressing stuff out there, and I get depressed sometimes too writing these reports. But what keeps me going are these really positive examples of joyful, meaningful community and people finding that at all ages and together. And I think we need to have that more in the conversation, that it's not about, oh no, change and density, and but that there's real possibility here for meaningful lives in later life, and how can we, and meaningful community interactions among all ages, and just really putting that front and center.
Well, thank you for ending on a positive note. I want to thank our panel for that lively discussion, and I think we talked about a lot of really important issues, and I hope we made a little bit of progress in the vital issue, the vital challenge of public education. Thank you all for listening.